Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tania Calle, and I am a CHCI DeVita Health Graduate Fellow, currently on the House Energy and Commerce Committee under Subcommittee of Health. I'm delighted to be with you all today for this breakout session entitled The Persistent Need for Diversity in Clinical Trials. As a former clinical researcher and devoted public health professional, the importance of today's conversation cannot be overstated. Historically, and in our present day, pregnant and lactating people, sexual and gender minorities, and people of color are consistently underrepresented in clinical trials. This lack of diversity and representation can have serious consequences, such as compromising the generalizability of clinical research findings, limiting access to effective medical interventions, and compounding health disparities. For these reasons and more, I am so excited to hear from our panelists on how to address this critical issue. So, without further ado, and on behalf of CHCI, I would like to thank BMS, Biogen, Boston Scientific, Horizon, American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, GSK, for their generous support of this session. It is now my honor to introduce the chair for this panel, Representante Jesus Chuy Garcia. Congressman Garcia proudly represents the 4th Congressional District of Illinois. He currently serves as a member of the influential Financial Services Committee and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. He's a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the Congressional Equality Caucus, the Congressional Pro-Choice Caucus, and New Americans Caucus. Unfortunately, the panel chair is not able to attend due to a joint meeting in Congress. However, we still have an opportunity to have a great conversation, so let's begin. To facilitate this panel, we are delighted to have Patricia Guadalupe as our moderator for this session. Patricia is a freelance journalist based in Washington, D.C. Guadalupe has reported for several media outlets, including National Public Radio's Latino USA, CBS Radio, and Pacific Radio Network. Please welcome our moderator.
Hi, thank you, Tania, and thank you, CHCI, for having me here. And I want to thank everybody for being in this really important session and the summit, especially today when it's so beautiful outside, and it's very tempting to be out there instead of in here. But I promise to make this as interesting as engaging as possible on this very important topic on the what is so important about having diversity in clinical trials. And first I want to thank our 3 panelists that are here. To my immediate left, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourselves to the audience.
Thank you, Patricia. Hello everyone, and thank you CHCI for having us here sharing on this important topic. I am Lorena Curi. I am the head of diversity strategy for Bristol Myers Squibb. That means clinical trial diversity is my full-time job. I've been doing this for the past 3 years, and I decided to intentionally look forward to something like this specific role because I worked for a number of years in commercial roles for Latin America and Canada in another company. And I was exposed to how this diversity may impact the way that drugs are approved or reimbursed in different countries. So when I saw this, I jumped into the opportunity, and I'm happy to be collaborating with today's panelists and many others that are in the same space sharing these efforts with me. Thank you.
Let me also echo my thanks to you, Patricia, and also to CHCI. My name is Mark Fleury. I'm a policy principal with the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, or ACS-CAN for short. We are the policy and advocacy arm of the American Cancer Society, and we work for public policies on the local, the state, and the federal level that promotes access to care and better treatments for patients with cancer. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. So good afternoon. My name is Wanda Castro Borrero. I am a global head of MS franchise, interference, and vampire at Biogen, and same as others, thank you for the opportunity to be here today for CHCI. For me and for Biogen, Biogen is committed to health equity, diversity, and inclusion in everything that we do. And for me, this is very personal. I'm original from Puerto Rico. That's where I always say my accent is. I'm a very proud Puerto Rican with the good and the bad. And I came from modest means, and we didn't have much at the table. And for me to be where I am now and help others is significant. And we need participation in clinical trials. It's one of the things that we keep saying we need the participation, but we don't know how to get there. So hopefully, with all of these minds, we can get some ideas, and with your help as future leaders, we can get to that position where we have actual representation.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. And let me go ahead and start with what sounds like a logical question. Why do we need to be in clinical trials? Especially looking at drug interaction, participation. Why don't I go ahead and start with you,
Sure.
Wanda?
I think that it's imperative that our clinical patients, our patients that are part of clinical trials are reflective of the real world and aligned with epidemiology because of, yes, a moral imperative, the moral need that we have. Like this is a care option as well. So we need to assure that it is out there for all eligible patients. The second one is there is a very important scientific imperative, right? Like it's an epidemiologic basis. There are some diseases that may disproportionately be affecting more one population than other. We saw it now with COVID, but it has happened forever. Heart failure, diabetes, prostate cancer, multiple myeloma, so many. And then it's also very important because safety and efficacy may be also reflective of different body compositions, body types, or things that are related to demographic and non-demographic characteristics, related as well with how we live. That's why it is so important that our patient population is reflective of the real world and aligned with epidemiology that we study.
So what are the biggest challenges, Mark, if you can answer that, on trying to get more Latinos in the clinical trials? One of a really good example, I think, is the oversampling of Latinos that Pfizer did for the COVID vaccine, which I think that they're doing that they did that in a very groundbreaking sort of way in that they had many more Latinos than even the proportion to the population in general, which I think is probably a good example to go into the future. But you still have a really small number of Latinos in general clinical trials. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, so I think there are sort of several issues at play. There's not sort of one simple answer here. It's a very complex issue. But I think what it really boils down to, especially in oncology, is access. Certainly, clinical trials are not open at every site. The ability to run a clinical trial is sort of a specialized skill, and it takes infrastructure. And certain sites, do this a lot. You think of your large academic medical centers. And so what we see is oftentimes clinical trials keep getting run at the same institutions and not at all institutions. And so depending on where you as a patient happen to walk through the door at an institution dictates whether or not you would have a clinical trial available to you. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to remove sort of that lottery, if you will, of do you have opportunity because of where you happen to get your care, by trying to look more at clinical trial screening in a regional manner. So in other words, right now in oncology anyway, if you walk into an institution, they may screen you for clinical trial eligibility, but it would only be for their clinical trials, even though there may be other opportunities only a few miles down the road. The one other thing that I would mention that I think, again, it varies a little bit by disease type, but in oncology, when we talk about registrational trials, and these are the trials that supply the data that gets submitted to the FDA, drug development is very much an international process. And in oncology, about 2/3 of the patients that make up drug submissions come from outside of the US. And that's predominantly from Eastern Europe and from Asia. And so, when you see a report that says, this drug was approved and this is the demographic makeup of the patients, that fit that, for example, you often don't see Latinos because very few trials are in the US, and those that are outside of the US aren't run in like, say, South or Central America. They're run in Europe or Asia. So even if US sites did a great job of recruiting Latinos and other typically underrepresented minorities, if those ex-US countries aren't also representative of the populations that make up the United States, you're not going to see the same proportion of patients reflected in those important clinical trials that tell us whether a drug works or not.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because I wanted to ask you about the role of mistrust, disinformation. You mentioned that you're from Puerto Rico, so am I, so here we go. We're all over the place. And we're proud.
So, yes.
But one of the things that maybe not too many people know about is that the birth control pill was tested in the population in Puerto Rico in the 1950s with a very high dosage. And the ramifications of that led to a lot of mistrust, misinformation, and not just in Puerto Rico, in the Latino community in general here, the same thing with other communities of color, the African American community, et cetera. So how is that level of mistrust, historical mistrust and disinformation, especially nowadays with social media saying, well, you know, the TikTok University College of Public Health told me this, you know. How much does that play into this?
So I would say that actually in the 1930s, before the pill, there was the forced sterilization. So 1/3 of the Puerto Rican women were sterilized, and there was no translation. They just brought the physician from the States, and they brought them in. They had the surgeries. They call it la operación, and for them to be able to work, they needed to be sterilized after having their first child. So this was to control the population, but this brought a lot of mistrust in the community. Then you brought the pill, and this is not only in the US. In California, it also happened with Mexican-American immigrants back in the 1940s and 50s. So there is, and not a lot of people know this, but at least in Puerto Rico, this is why my grandfather didn't want me to be a physician, so I went to pharmacy school first, because pharmacists were more respectable, they trust with the people, they have a lot of trust, and physicians don't. And these days has improved, but there is a lot of mistrust from the providers. There's a lot of mistrust for the industry that I represent as well, and misinformation. You say, when I was in practice, I had a lot of patients that had I would say they were the Google Doc. They will come to me with everything they found in Google, and they will ask me, oh, this is what I have. And I'm like, no, that's not what you have. Let's just talk real. And following up on something Mark said about real world evidence, in case, and I can talk a little bit more later, but if not, clinical trials are designed and very controlled so we can get the data that we need to get the drugs approved, right? So there might not be a lot of Latinos and a lot of representation, even though we're doing strides to improve this, and I can talk a little bit more about that too. But real world evidence is important, and we need, if you don't have the access to those trials in the community, maybe you have the access to your doctor and registries and other ways that we can improve the data needed to support our groups. And also something that, for the first question you had on, something that is key is, for example, albuterol, right? When the albuterol trials came in, there was not a lot of Puerto Ricans or African Americans, and asthma is more prevalent in them. And then they noticed when they started using it in the population that it didn't work as well. Why? Because it was not tested in these communities. Same as the sleeping pill was tested mostly in male, and then women, when they came to the market, women were having overdoses, and they have to drug the dose. So we need, those are key why we need representation in clinical trials.
So let me ask of any one of you folks, what are the best practices, what are the best steps then to overcome the type of misinformation, wrong information out there to get more Latinos to participate in clinical trials? What do you think?
The need is multifactorial, of course, and community outreach efforts are imperative, of course. We need to educate, generate more awareness around prevention, treatment, clinical trials opportunities as clinical care to everyone who is eligible, right? And for that, we need to engage before, during, and after patients and caregivers are in need of becoming patients and caregivers. So we do not look at them only as an immediate need to recruit more patients or more specific patients. But those efforts that are super important require two keys. The first one is engaging with trusted voices, being very mindful of what culture means. It's not only about the wording, the language, or the images, it's about what we depict when we're saying, and assuring that those interactions are sustainable. That is one part. These will only work if the trials are designed inclusively. The eligibility criteria, the inclusion and exclusion, all those different thresholds that the patient needs to meet in order to participate in a trial, sometimes inadvertently are overseeing patients that have higher incidence or prevalence as a racial or ethnic minority group. So the thought about clinical trial diversity needs to happen early in the development process, so that those community outreach efforts combined with this design kind of merge into a broader representation of the real world.
How much of a factor are community-based organizations, like you mentioned, such as like promotoras de salud, you know, and folks like that, where you're not only you're doing outreach in the community, but you know the folks so that they trust you? How much of a factor is that kind of thing?
I don't have a specific quantification to that, but it's not only about the principal investigator, it's the entire clinical care team, the social workers, the patient navigators, the community ambassadors. More and more, they have been playing such a significant role in patient care. And we know, and as sponsors and as part of the industry and in collaboration with others, we've been increasing the opportunities for this type of roles because they have this built trust, right? And they speak the same language, which is not only a matter of English or Spanglish or something like that. Is feeling, is fully being understanding of those needs. So it is imperative. We do believe as well that this, we call it the concordance factor or level of trust between someone who looks like me as a treating physician. I usually prefer to go with a Latino woman, preferably, but if not, I will go with someone who has an accent, so I'm more comfortable. So we also are pursuing the opportunity, pursuing the effort of having a broader representation in our principal investigators, sub-investigators, nurses, on all of them who are part of the caregiving process.
Well, when you have an accent, that means that you speak more than one language, so, you know.
And Patricia, I would say also, also at Biogen, we have different initiatives. For example, the Community Advisory Board is something that has been done to have the community involved early on in the design of the clinical trials. We're also partnering. Collaborations are important, as Lorena said. This is multifactorial, right? So collaborations with others, like the National Minority Quality Forum, with CHCI, and other partners that can help us advance and get information. We also have a study with Boston Medical, which has a large majority of minorities in the Massachusetts area, and how can we, with this partnership, improve the number of diversity in our clinical trials. So.
Go ahead. I was going to go ahead and ask you to see if
so I mean, I think when we think about the barriers that keep patients in general out of clinical trials, as well as Latinos, we need to divide that in between the things that are very patient and individual specific and things that are inherent in the system. And I think we need to address both of those. And again, I keep going to oncology because that's what I know best. But we typically say that between 5% and 7% of cancer patients enroll in a clinical trial, and sometimes sort of what is implied is that the other 94% are not enrolling. They've made a decision not to enroll. But when we actually look at the research and the statistics, about 85% of cancer patients will never get the chance to enroll in a clinical trial, not because of anything that any personal barrier. It's because the system doesn't have a clinical trial for them, didn't open it at a site where they're being seen, they weren't screened for it and asked to enroll. So in oncology, we know that if a patient is actually asked to enroll and they're eligible, 55%, so more than half, will say yes to it. And that actually does not vary by race or ethnicity. So Hispanics, Asians, African Americans, and white all say yes to oncology clinical trial participation at the same rate. So what that tells us is that there's this giant barrier. 85% of patients, the system is failing them because the trial wasn't designed for them, it wasn't open in a site for them, they weren't screened for it, they weren't given the opportunity. Now that's not to say that people still who are eligible don't say no, and we need to figure out ways to meet their needs as well. And I think we heard in the last plenary session, there's a lot of issues. One of the things that ACS CAN is really involved in is financial issues. We know that patients who come from families that make less than $50,000 a year are about 30% less likely to enroll in a clinical trial. So they're really sensitive to anything cost-wise. And we know that there are more than medical costs involved. So, right, if you've ever gone to a major academic medical center and gotten your parking ticket and you realize, it's $30 to go for an appointment. Mm-hmm. That's not covered by insurance, right? So we're working on legislation, I think it was mentioned in the last session as well, the Reverse Trial Act, that would allow sponsors to pay for those types of things. But we're also looking at things like trial decentralization. So, again, if you're an hourly worker or you live in a rural area and it's an hour-and-a-half drive to the medical center, what if you could take care of some of those visits by opening up, your phone and talking to somebody or filling out an online questionnaire? So I think, we need to think about those barriers both sort of from the system, where's the system failing, but where do individuals have needs and where can the system provide support, whether that's economic, technological, cultural competencies, communications, education, and things like that. So it really is a multifaceted issue.
Just want to remind folks that you'll have a chance to ask some questions in a few minutes. I wanted to follow up on what you're saying about the system failing. So looking forward, looking ahead, what are some of the recommendations that you all would have on things that you can do to help the system from, moving away from that failure, such as, on the Metro every once in a while, or even online, you'll see ads for clinical trials at the NIH, National Institutes of Health. All of that is in English. I rarely see anything in Spanish or any other language for that matter. So what are some of the things that you would recommend for folks to, not just outreach in the community, but on the other side, the folks that are doing the clinical trials saying, we can't find anybody. Well, what are you doing to find them?
So I can say something that we're doing already at Biogen. One of the collaborations with the National Minority Quality Forum is the Clinical Trial Index. And this is to map the patients from Medicare and Medicaid, where these patients, the minority, live. This will help us when we are designing clinical trials to get to those areas, right? Because when you do clinical trials, you get CROs, right? Clinical research organizations that helps you establish where you're going to do your clinical trial. So they usually go to big MS centers or big academic centers, big academic centers, because they have the volume, they have the experience, they have the capabilities. Problem is, these are big cities, usually are your typical white population and not your minority. So when we look at these other areas and we're able to identify sites that have patients that are minorities, then we can improve this. And something that we have done very deliberately is for one of our upcoming trials, we have designed the population to be similar to the population of lupus. So we have more patient participation of minorities. And this certainly will help identify not only any adverse events or any efficacy issues early on, so when the product comes to market, we know we have the data to back up for this population. That's something that I think not only us, other companies are also doing, right? So it's just this way of trying to engage more patients in the trials.
Do you think that having people in decision-making positions, such as yourself, a Latina, it sounds like a logical question, obviously, but you're conscious of what is needed out there in the community.
Oh, definitely.
So that in the pipeline of the industry to have people who say, you know what, we don't have enough Latinos in here, we don't have enough African Americans in here, we don't have enough Asian Americans, because they know.
Yeah, definitely. We need that. When I was in practice before I joined Biogen, I remember when I give my resignation, it was very hard because I have a large population of Hispanics. I was working at Hartford, Connecticut. It was really hard, but I was burned out, and I didn't have what I needed to maintain the clinic, and I felt for those patients. But when I gave my resignation, and they said, "Is there anything we can keep you here?" And I said, "Well, I give you my demands and what we need, a better clinic for the patients, et cetera." And they said, "Well, it's a loss. We're losing a double minority." So it is good. This morning we were talking here about, how to increase the pool of Latinos in the healthcare system. And I think it's important, and it's not because you're a minority, you're a woman and a Hispanic, it's because it's the right thing to do. So I think that has to be embedded in our society. And you guys as future leaders, that's something that any policy making, anything that we can do to make sure that everyone is here, is at the table, and it's because of the right reasons, not because it's a mandate that is important.
Mm-hmm. And we need to continue all these efforts, right? Evidently, at a workplace level, the more inclusive that the workplace is, the more inclusive the marketplace will be. Because those who are designing the trials may already think in advance of what's happening with a patient that is already diverse. We are powered by people at Bristol Myers Squibb, and we do have aspirational goals on representation, both at internal and external. But what is the most important thing is that we keep on doing this together, because we truly need to bring back that credibility and trust to the patients. And no sponsor, no institution, nobody's going to do it by themselves. This is a collaborative space, and we need to continuously be highlighting the voice of this. And as Latinos, it's extremely important, because just something as simple as the data collection of ethnicity is very, very difficult for us to address. I became a Latino 10 years ago, right, when I came to the US. Before that, I would qualify as white in Mexico. So that type of things, how do we evolve? Because this is still a very fluid space. How do we evolve, and how do we keep those metrics going?
How much of a factor has the COVID pandemic played in clinical trials, in that people are saying, well, you know what? Everything, all the COVID, the hospitals are full of COVID, I don't know if there's any clinical trials for diabetes or any cancer medications, because everyone is focused on COVID. How much of a factor do you think that is?
Well, the effect of the pandemic, I think, can't be understated. I mean, both in just the sheer loss of human life. I mean, we just passed the grim milestone of 1 million deaths in the US, but for what it did to clinical research, clinical trials in oncology, I wouldn't say ground to a halt, but they enrollment slowed way down. New trial openings went way down, because basically a lot of the sites were only allowing what they call critical visits, and they weren't viewing clinical trials as critical. We've just really suffered, some effects that we're going to be feeling for the years to come in the research that wasn't done during this time. But one of the things I would say is there has been a silver lining to COVID and clinical trials. That being, I went to lots of sort of think tanks and policy conferences, pre-pandemic, and people talked about for years, one day we won't have to actually go into the clinic. We can do this by telemedicine, or we'll deliver your medicines to your house. And it was always aspirational, and it was like, one day we'll be able to do this. And it was always aspirational. I mean, in the matter of literally a couple of months, the industry and regulators found the will and found the way. We saw so much innovation in the course of months that hadn't happened in years, where sponsors really switched up the way they ran their clinical trials. They started sending stuff to people's home. They allowed them to, do some of the visits with their local provider instead of driving into the academic medical center. Visits via telemedicine if it wasn't a blood draw or something like that. And so we saw some massive changes, and I think we'll see some of those stick going forward. And again, I think we still have to see, will they increase disparities or will they decrease them? I mean, they certainly could decrease them, because they allow people to enroll who maybe not physically close to the site that's running the clinical trial. But the flip side is sort of, do you have high-speed internet and all the tech capabilities, and are the people on the other end going to speak your language and things like that. So I think they certainly offer an enormous amount of promise, but I think we need to, like any other policy and any other change, we need to do it right to make sure that we don't sort of fix one thing and break another in the process. But I think we can look at the silver lining as well as sort of the negative impacts of the pandemic.
How confident are you about the legislation that you had mentioned earlier, passing both houses, going to the president's desk to start mitigating some of those issues that you had mentioned?
Well, I think, I've been working in this space for a decade in policy and clinical trials, and never have I seen as much interest and support behind provisions related to diversity in research and clinical trials. So we know that the Diverse Trials Act has three main provisions. One is a safe harbor for financial support. One is a safe harbor for providing the technology you need to be part of these remote trials. And the third is to require FDA to write guidance about how to conduct clinical trials in a way that will increase diversity. That third piece was actually included in some what we call must-pass legislation, the user fee reauthorization that has to be passed by the end of September. And so I'm pretty confident that piece will get in. The other two pieces, we may have to pass the bill as a standalone, but sponsorship is increasing. There's a lot of interest. And there are a lot of other policy and regulatory issues that are active right now. So another provision in PDUFA, this must-pass legislation, it would require sponsors to submit to the FDA a diversity plan. So up front, when they say we're going to start a drug development plan and here's the clinical trials we plan to run, you also have to add, and how, what are our targets for diversity, demographics, and how will we do that? And so PDUFA would put teeth in that and say, if you don't do it, there's consequences. So again, I think we're seeing a lot of these policies, again, not just be aspirational, but have real potential to get across the finish line. So.
Yes,
Go ahead.
And I think it needs to continue, right? Because once they pass, there is also a lot of work that needs to be done on helping patients understand what exactly it means and how to interpret what they can pursue and what they can advocate for. So, and that's again another collaborative effort. And I'm happy to see, to your point, FDA recently presenting the draft guidelines for the diversity plans. Many of us have been doing them for quite some time and still are having questions on is it going to work? How do we measure it? Is it going to be enough? And many of us are aware that there is much more to do.
Before we open it up to questions from the audience, what do you all recommend to our audience members that they can do to move the issue forward, to make sure that there are more Latinos in clinical trials, to make the community more aware of these kinds of opportunities? If you want to go ahead.
Well, I can start. I would say one of the things that I think all of you can do is if there's no, how can I say, you can talk to your family members, right? And your friends and all the different ones. And if you don't have clinical trials in your area, there are other real-world work that can be done that gets data, right? So ensuring that your medical records are complete when you go to your doctor's appointment, that is one of the key things. I do a lot of real-world evidence with MS registries, for example, and when I look at the data, the Hispanic data is always incomplete, and I don't know why. I can assume that is because either they didn't provide the information or the physician or the provider didn't ask the information. So it's really key that at least your information is there, that when they ask you, do you want to participate in this registry or answer these questions? Yes. Maybe it's not going to be a benefit for you, but it might be a benefit for others. And you're contributing to create data that can help improve. And I think that is a little piece that we can all do, ensure our medical records are complete.
And what about for advocating if you're a caregiver for somebody who has limited English. That is a huge issue, especially when you have parents who rely on their children. And, you know, the doctor says something complicated medically, and the child says, es que estás enfermo, you know?
I want to say something about that, and I was mentioning to the team, my mom passed away of cancer. It's going to be 9 years on Monday. But what is very interesting is like we have this in our community that you don't want to hear about cancer, right? So, and then I don't know in your communities, but back in Puerto Rico, it's like, oh, they don't need to know they have cancer because they have 6 months to live, so don't tell them. And that doesn't happen, right? Here in the States, my experience when I was in clinic is like you have the 8-year-old translating to the parent, and when you're going to talk about something sensitive, bowel, bladder, sexual dysfunction, and multiple sclerosis, you don't want the child to be talking about this. It's wrong, it's unethical. You need to have a system in place, someone that knows the medical terms and can do the translation. You also need to have documents in Spanish. And you need to have the information, not only the informed consent for clinical trials, but information, our products about drugs. That's something that we have done also at Biogen for MS, ensuring that we have translated the documents, and cultural competency. I have seen a lot of providers in my field that they don't want any training in cultural competence because they are well, they don't have issues. But truly, those are the first ones. When you deny that you have a problem and you don't feel that you can learn something, that is your first issue. So cultural competence is very important, and there are many ways that clinics can be set up to help our communities, and not only Hispanics, but also Asians, Americans, anyone that doesn't speak English, because all of us are in the same boat.
So what would you recommend to somebody who is one of the caregivers of a limited English person who may be afraid to advocate or to, you know, take it a little bit further and saying, well, I don't know, I'm kind of afraid. What do you tell them?
So many recommendations, right? Like get informed, but get informed accurately, not through social media exclusively, right? Reach out to patient advocacy organizations. That's also super empowering. And right now, many patient advocates are also pursuing that diversity that depicts what a lay patient means. Try to find a provider that you are comfortable with, that even is comfortable with you asking for that second opinion, and get a partner. Like there are so many opportunities of understanding through the support of a patient navigator, a community ambassador, like what are those terminologies. But I think that we have a responsibility of starting at home and educating our families. Whenever we know about a diagnosis, not exclusively for cancer, for any type of acute or chronic disease, like have you asked the question about, is there a clinical trial that could work for me, either here or somewhere else, because we need to make sure that we're informed that those are also clinical options.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. We'll just wait until you bring the microphone here, and if you can identify, oh, we have one right here. Identify yourself when you're speaking.
Buenas tardes, everyone. Ricardo Sanchez. I'm with Bristol Myers Squibb. You know, again, thank you for all this. Yeah, you kind of asked my questions. So I was like, you took my guns away.
Well, you could ask it again.
But I'm gonna ask it again, and I'm gonna ask it and just kind of rephrase it. The last question was, you know, what can we do? And I know from just my experiences, because I've lived through all of these things where I was the child translating and trying to make sense of things that I didn't even understand myself. And yet to this day, you know, 25 years later, I'm still in this position where I have family both in Colombia and here in the US, or where I grew up, where I'm getting asked all the time, hey, mijo, what is this? You know, where am I supposed to go with this? Like, I went to this appointment, you know, am I gonna get a bill? All of these things. And I have a foot in the door only because I am in pharma now, right? So I have been in pharma for 2 years, yet even I struggle trying to find these answers. And so for us that are in this panel, for the audiences that are going to listen to this later, where can we go that's a little bit more easier? You know, we heard about, you know, reaching out to a physician, reaching out to the community. But me here, I can't I can't find that information, and I want to find that good information in Colombia, in New Jersey, where I grew up in. Where can like the average person go to get this information, or in a way that's going to be correct and culturally competent?
Yeah, good.
So I mean, I think you highlight an important challenge, and I think one of the things that was mentioned before was patient navigators, and unfortunately, they're not a routine part of medical care today, largely because they aren't reimbursed. So some institutions have them, and they sort of cobble them together with grants and other funding. But that's really the purpose of a patient navigator, right? Is to be there to answer questions and to educate and tell you what this means and why you need this next scan and things like that. So that is one area again, I come from an advocacy organization, so I always go sort of to the macro policy picture. But so we have been looking about how, we can get navigation as more routine part of care that would be reimbursed as other providers are. So I think that's one avenue is, find out if your health system has a navigator, and if they don't, join the advocacy to try and make that a more standard part. But I will say that patient advocacy organizations are also good places to go for information. I know that ACS, for example, has some of their material, but not all in Spanish. But I think, there are, whether it's neurological or, any other, name the disease, try and seek out a patient advocacy organization, especially that has a focus on, say, Latinos, as a good source of, high quality information. But I mean, I think there's no easy answer, and I think it's highlighted a really important need in the environment.
Go ahead.
I was going to say for multiple sclerosis specifically, right? Advocacy groups, as Mark said, MS Foundation is established in Florida. They have all the resources in Spanish, all of them, and it's amazing library. And you have the National MS Society as well. So advocacy groups is always a good place to start. They usually have one area for at least Hispanics, and I think that is a good way to look at it.
And I will also add community outreach organizations. We have seen, for example, how the Black community has been unifying their voices with Black Health Matters, with the Essence Festival, and many others. We are spread around, but yet there are so many useful organizations out there. We need US, Salud America. We need to get close. So the work that Dr. Sandoval is doing around here, all of those are really useful. So let's continue asking those questions. Let's not set with the first thing that we hear, especially as patients and caregivers, before we are in need of becoming patients and caregivers. And we need to be brave. And we need, as sponsors as well, to continue educating not only on health literacy, but in civic literacy. Because usually underrepresented communities are not comfortable asking questions or just learning how to navigate. That's part of what we need to bring as well.
Yeah, the fact that you're here is, with an organization that has a lot of connections and things, it's always good to follow up, definitely. We have a question. Thank you for your question. We have a question here. And if you could identify yourself.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Avian Sterl. I'm a medical educator with Bayer Pharmaceuticals. I actually have two questions. It was mentioned earlier that sometimes clinical trials are designed to get the results that you need from the FDA. Can you talk about how exclusion contributes to that? My second question as well, in terms of the harms that have been done with previous clinical trials, what protections are in place now to protect current participants for these studies?
Good question.
Maybe I'll start a little bit
Okay,
with
go
the
ahead.
second question,
Okay.
the protection of the harms. So I think it's interesting the history of some of the really gross injustices that have occurred in medical research. So if you go back 75 years ago, medical research was largely unregulated, and it was seen as something to avoid at all costs. Because it was unregulated, and this is where the idea of sort of guinea pigs come in, and you have some of the experiments we heard about in Puerto Rico, but you also have the syphilis studies in Tuskegee, and of course the Nazi experiments in World War II, and so that was an era when research was unregulated and it was dangerous, and so it tended to only be conducted on people who couldn't say no or weren't fully informed, so prisoners and low income and things like that. So post-World War II is sort of the Belmont Report. It was this, seismic shift that said, listen, the medical community has gotten this all wrong, and there is an ethics around research. And so since then, there's this whole infrastructure around what's called institutional review boards, have to review every single research protocol and make sure that it is ethical and that they're being given informed consent. They know what they're walking into. They know they can say no at any time. And that whatever the experiment is, that there's a reasonable probability it's the same risk as normal care. So you can't give something, deprive a curative treatment of somebody with something else if you know something works. So a lot of sort of wonky stuff there, but what's interesting is that sort of minorities and poor and in prison were all the participants, years ago when it was risky, and now research is really seen as the opportunity to have first access to some of the most cutting edge, treatment, and now that it's seen as desirable, the tables have flipped. Those people of low income and minorities are not getting in. So, it's interesting historically, but to the point, there is an infrastructure that basically, institutional review boards in those communities have to look at the research and agree that it's ethical. And then, of course, every patient still has the opportunity to say yes or no, which historically had not always been the case. Many times it was done without their knowledge. So. I'll let somebody else answer the other one if you.
The first one I don't recall, but to include, that exactly what Mark has said about the standards, and also each clinical trial has a safety review board. If there's any safety issues that had been highlighted, there could be stop parameters for the study. Patients can be pulled out of the trial because they have a specific adverse event that has occurred or potential adverse event. So there multiple parameters, and I cannot recall the first question, my apologies.
The eligibility criteria, was it around inclusion and exclusion criteria?
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Was it around inclusion and exclusion criteria?
Yes, you mentioned earlier that some were conducted now.
Sure.
For that, or I guess.
Yeah, sure, maybe I can take that.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And heads up, I'm not a clinician, I am a musician, but I'm also a connector. But I've learned so many things on the work that I've been doing with multiple teams. Things as simple as body mass index and cholesterol level. Half of the Latinos were out of many trials because of that threshold on obesity that we may pursue. Things others such as serum creatinine in Black patients. Somehow what happens with the eligibility criteria is that scientifically it has been created to make sure who can be part of the trial and who cannot. What we have been doing right now, and I am aware of many other sponsors in the industry doing it as well, is understanding what is the impact with real-world evidence, the historical eligibility criteria that we have in our organizations, and the impact of screen failures and race and ethnicity. Those exercises were not intentionally done before, and it's amazing that now with the draft guidelines of FDA to assuring that we have a diversity plan in place, we make it part of the development process because it was not there. This is an unknown world, and a lot of the work that we are doing right now is on learning and relearning and creating flexibility in the minds of our scientists so they kind of review these from the very beginning. So multiple things.
And I will add to, basically we go back to what Mark said initially, right? So there was all this horrible things that happen with research, right? So now you want it regulated, and you're regulating so much that is very controlled. So only very specific people can get in these trials. That is the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it is very controlled, and you don't have access to everybody, right? If it's a condition for multiple sclerosis, and I know my drug might cause X, has the minimal potential of cause this interaction with X, I don't have any of those patients that are on that drug, or I don't have any patient that has this condition, so then it's very limited, the data I got. But then real world evidence is where it makes the big difference, because that everyone can be part of real world evidence. That's what I said, the minimum thing you can do is have your medical records be completed and participate in registries, because then that data is more rich, and then we can understand how the drug really affects everybody in the system.
Hey, thank you for your question. You have a question over here?
Hi, my name is Javier Cuevas. I do consulting work. I'm the managing director for Amelia Consulting Group, and I do healthcare. And Patricia, thank you so much for always being a leader in facilitating these discussions. My question is, and I have seen it throughout the day and my own personal experience, there seems to be a need to have a calibration between advertisement and direct engagement. Given your experiences, could you basically do a recommendation in terms of the formula? Because sometimes the campaigns are really heavy in advertisement, but then there's not necessarily an allocation for the community group, for the promotoras and the ambassadors in the African American community and others. How you think should be a balance in terms of making sure, I don't know if the legislation you mentioned before covers that, but sometimes, I mean, there seems to be sometimes it goes really heavy into the advertisement, but not necessarily direct engagement. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Javier.
Yeah, I'm not sure, sorry, not sure I quite understood the question.
In terms of making sure that people really get the grasp of the importance of these issues, a lot of it is really a lot of advertisement out there, but then not necessarily that much into the direct engagement, the promotoras, making sure that there's a one-on-one peer-to-peer kind of influence. This conversation seems to be, and others throughout the day, are about make sure that you tell the people around you. So in terms of allocations, funding for planning purposes, what are your thoughts in terms of the formula?
I'm really not sure about that, I will say. I think that talking Biden and the company, right, we don't do a lot of advertisement to our products, right? That is one thing that we have certain. We have seen others that do more wide advertisement, other companies, we don't. We go more towards the communities, maybe because we're a smaller company, but I'm not sure. I really cannot really answer the question regarding advertisements versus the community, but certainly the community needs the funding, right? Because they are the ones that are frontline in a way and can give the better message. How they get the funding, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe a little less about the funding, but engagement. So one of the promising trends that I've seen over the last 10 years is, when we talk about how a clinical trial is designed, oftentimes a bunch of scientists go back in a room and, figure out what questions they want to answer and sort of design a clinical trial in isolation. And those clinical trials often ignore sort of real world issues. So they ask you to come in for way too many tests that sort of are repetitive, and those are the things that make a person say no. They look at sort of, would you like to enroll in this clinical trial? And you have to come in 18 times over the next month and, all this kind of stuff. And so there's been a recognition that the clinical trials need to be designed with patient input from the outset. And so we have seen from the FDA a much greater emphasis on incorporating patient perspectives to begin with. And so that's done both sort of on a very specific level. So, a sponsor may be starting a clinical trial and they're encouraged to bring in patient focus groups to say, hey, here's what's important to us. But I think also on a broader scale, so for example, somebody might develop a drug for a disease and it treats symptoms that maybe those people with that disease care the least about. I have 10 symptoms and you just created a drug that helps me with symptom number 10 on my priority list and not 1, 2, and 3. And so there's been a lot more effort, both by patient groups and the FDA, to try and pull together what are those priorities of people living with a given disease and with different, in different communities, to try and understand so that we don't have these sort of people talking past each other. The patients want one thing, and a drug development company or researcher is trying to answer a completely different question. And the idea that a lot more things like patient-reported outcomes are included in drug labels. So asking a patient, what was your experience on the drug, not just did your tumor shrink or can you walk faster, but what was your quality of life? So I do think, it doesn't get to your question of funding, but I think there's a clear message that if you're going to conduct research, it shouldn't be on patients, but with patients as a partner. And so I think that is, we still have a long ways to go, but I think it's a promising trend that we're seeing.
And I'm happy that you mentioned patient-reported outcomes, because that's a very important example, right? As we incorporate them as part of the thresholds. What I would say on communication, it needs to be credible. There needs to be credibility and sustainability, right? In the past, we would see multiple ads on TV for many drugs, and you would see, these are actors. These do not depict like specific patients. Because there was no enough representation. And now we're pursuing that representation because I need to see myself in a specific, to see if I can ask that question, right? Mm-hmm. So hopefully by continuously doing this together, we don't stop. And we make it as a regular thing, and we do it through the now evolving channels like social media, YouTube, you were talking about TikTok and all of those things. Really, those are resources for patients. So as sponsors, we have a responsibility to assure that advocacy organizations have availability to credible information. One of the other effects of COVID is we were aware of how fast information and misinformation can spread. So some damage control that we're doing right now, let's assure that everybody has access to it. So, and hopefully, as I said before, it's sustainable.
So, in other words, don't get your information from the TikTok University College of Public Health. Of course, we always run out of time when we start to get talking about really interesting topics as this one. So I wanted to, before we close, ask you if you had any closing remarks that you wanted to give to our audience, whether, a call to action or next steps. What do you think? Let me start with you. Go ahead.
With me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say, importantly, be ambassadors, right, for our communities. Ensure that clinical trials are important. We all have different conditions, right? If you cannot participate in a clinical trial, do real-world evidence, file a registry, but be our ambassadors. Health equity, and this is something I'm very passionate about, and for some people, I think they say I'm too passionate, but for me, it's very important to have my voice heard at the company that, health equity is key, diversity and inclusion. I always look out for my patients, and I talk about my Hispanic patients when I'm in the meetings or when I'm talking in clinical trials, designs and things. So be ambassadors when you go out.
Okay. Mark, do you want to add closing remarks?
So obviously we're in Washington, D.C., and I work for a policy and advocacy group. So, my heart goes straight to policy and advocacy. And ACS CAN, I guess it's been about a year ago, we published a report with recommendations, and you can find it at fightcancer.org/research disparities. But in that, we make a number of recommendations. We both sort of expose some of the disparities in research, and this is everything from workforce to clinical trial participation, and make some specific recommendations about things to do. But I think, certainly here in Washington, D.C., there's no shortage of opportunities to advocate for things like the Diverse Trial Act and other policy changes that will really change the landscape that we're operating in.
Tell us the name again of the...
fightcancer.org/research disparities.
Okay, great. Do you want to add any closing thoughts?
Sure. I think that as individuals, we already have a privilege. We're sitting here, we are being informed. So as my manager always says, charity starts at home. Make sure that you help inform your families and your communities about what you heard today, about what you know, that how a clinical trial may be a support on a clinical decision or as part of a treatment. And the other one is build resilience, because this work is just starting. So you know that many of us have been in this space for a long time, but let's convert this momentum into a movement and make sure that there is continuity moving forward.
Well, I want to thank our panelists today for this very interesting and very important topic and conversation. And I wanted to thank all the audience members, and to remember that to continue to tweet hashtag CHCI Summit. And this is where an accent is very important, where the plenary session next is delivering a better future for our mamas. So imagine what it would be without the accent. So,
Muchas gracias.
yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.